is so great to finally have you back on the podcast. I know you've been a guest several times, and I think of all the guests I've ever had, you're probably the favorite of so many listeners. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to sit down and discuss this incredible article that you wrote exploring the different ways that Freud and Lacan understood love. I know we're going to get into it in a moment, but I guess before we start, I did want to begin at this point. In this article, which you entitled "On the Subject of Love," you dedicate it to the memory of Mari Ruti, who recently passed this year. And I was wondering if you could just maybe speak to why you decided to dedicate it to her, and is there anything that maybe you could tell us about the type of relationship that you had in the last years of her life?
Sure. Let me first say thanks for having me back. I'm
Of
delighted,
course.
and I'm always delighted by your astute but also available and kind of open questions. So it's always a fun time for me to talk to you about some of this stuff. So thanks for that. Mari, I can't claim Mari was a super close friend, at least in the conventional definition of that. I only really was personally with her 3 or 4 times. We, in the last year or two, developed a kind of an email relationship. She was not able to travel as much, and was often either in Finland or with her mother, or in Nova Scotia at her home. Oddly, she was almost never in Toronto, where she was a distinguished professor. But we had some wonderful talks. She had read and reviewed the last couple of books of mine, the memoir about my son's death, and the book about a Lacanian theory of religion. And she was, I think particularly the book about my son's death was a real point of mutual recognition and support. She knew she was going to die.
Mm.
The cancer that had, or she basically was very close to being resigned. She knew that the chances were really slim. So we had a lot of really heavy talks about death, and especially about death as the ultimate unknown. I've been kind of obsessed, fascinated, I guess, if you want to be a little more generous, with the question of what we cannot know, and the power of that zone of unknowing, that for the most part we don't think about very much. I think often people are actually not aware of it at all, because in a way it's an empty set. We don't know what we don't know. And
Yeah.
Mari was, I think, at the end of her life, particularly by natural, kind of necessity, facing death herself, was really needed to talk about this stuff. And anyway, so it made for, in the last year or two of knowing each other, especially a special intimacy, though interestingly across a distance.
Yeah. Rick, I so appreciate you kind of sharing some of that. I know I have a lot of listeners that really love her work, and I think that'll be meaningful to them to hear kind of how you were connected to her. Now, if we can, for a moment, if we're just kind of jumping into the article on the subject of love, you begin by laying out how Sigmund Freud understood love. And one of the first things you get into is how he saw it as connected to a type of narcissism. And I'm wondering if you could maybe start there, because I think a lot of people that are listening who maybe aren't familiar with Freud may think of narcissistic personality disorder. It's not quite what he meant. Where would you want to start in helping us understand Freud's relationship to love and this concept of narcissism?
Okay, well, yeah, right. That's exactly the angle I take. maybe let me preface this by saying I myself was surprised at what came out when I took on the task of writing this article. Um, I had a dim sense of what it might be, but it was one of those moments, I must say, increasingly frequent in my own writing life, where I get into a topic and the various threads begin to lead me in a direction that I didn't expect. And in this piece, which I think won't be out for a year, it's going to be a book of essays. So it's a kind of a chapter of an upcoming book, edited by Julie Reshi and Todd McGowan. It says something that was surprising to me. I did not really anticipate, but what popped out was that Freud's basic take on the love relation is fundamentally different from Lacan's. Lacan really takes off in a different direction. And the first step in understanding the difference is to say that Freud really relies, not exclusively, you could find counter examples, but for the most part, Freud relates love, romantic love, to his category of narcissism, which means, of course, that what's at stake for Freud is the stability and the acceptability of the ego. Love bolsters my sense of myself. The payoff is I feel better about my own ego, about my own image of myself. The self I would like to be able to claim is really me. And to anticipate a little bit, the Lacanian counter is, maybe not surprisingly, parallel to Lacan's, what you could say is his most important single innovation over Freud, which is to distinguish between the ego and the sujet, the subject. It's not just the moi of the ego, the me in English, but also the je, the I. And for Lacan, the I of the subject, as opposed to the me of the ego. The I is what for him stands for my unconscious desire. The subject is the location, you might say, or the kind of dimension of what, from the ego's standpoint, is in me more than me, in me what is strange to me. And this, I basically, in this piece, I trace out this opposition. But yes, Freud starts with the question of love as a function of narcissism.
Yeah, no, that's so well said. Now, yeah, focusing on Freud for one second, in the piece, you give this sort of illustration or example of where we see this, I think, in a lot of men, in the trophy wife. And I was wondering if maybe you could reflect on that, or maybe elaborate why you chose that as an example of kind of Freud's understanding of love.
Yeah, the trophy wife, it's almost makes the picking too easy. The trophy wife, and even the relationship of both the man who has the trophy wife draped on his arm, but also the woman who's herself, who accepts the role of the trophy wife. In both cases, it's almost pure narcissism. For the man, he's got this gorgeous woman on his arm, accompanying his every step, hopefully looking up at him with kind of wide open and admiring eyes. So he is walking into a room with this gorgeous thing on his arm, and thereby he gets the envy of every other male in the room. They say, oh my God, look what, Jose's just walked in with. So it's flattering to his sense of ego. It puffs him up to have her as his toy. On the other hand, it's a narcissistic rush for her too, in two ways. One is she's able to kind of say, well, look, guys, you may think this guy's impressive, but don't forget, he's chosen me.
Mm.
And furthermore, everybody who is impressed and intimidated in the room when the couple of, the cool guy and his trophy wife have just walked in, usually the rich guy, right? The Rupert Murdoch who walks in with Jerry Hall, Mick Jagger's old girlfriend on his sleeve. This has the effect for her of being a tremendous ego boost. I mean, she's really riding it. All eyes are on me, because I'm the thing that's making him sexy. So it's for both sides a real ego rush, or to put it in Freud's term, a festival of narcissistic gratification.
Ooh, a festival of narcissistic gratification. Wow, that's an impressive statement there.
Now, by the way, just as a little footnote to this, when the trophy wife walks in the room, notice how everybody in the room is enjoying it.
Mm.
He's enjoying being looked at by everybody else and envied.
Getting the
She's enjoying
attention.
it because everybody's looking at her as the babe that she is, really attractive and so on. Notice even the person in the room, like maybe Kike Autry or Rick Boothby, might look over and say, oh, come on, another
Yeah.
trophy wife thing. Are you so insecure that you really need this? Both of you need
It's like
this.
how cliche.
What a cliche. But even then, notice we're enjoying a kind of narcissism of belittling the guy and his woman
That's a
as
really good
just
point.
doing something stupid, and then we feel, oh man, aren't I cool? I can analyze this with my psychoanalytic tools. That's a form of narcissism too. It's kind of like the trophy wife syndrome is a narcissistic festival for everybody.
Mm. That's brilliant, Boothby. I love that. Okay, yeah, that's good. Now, okay, in the article, kind of the next thing that you get into, and I know that we could spend the whole episode talking about this, so maybe we could spend a little bit of time connecting Freud's understanding of love with object love, and then you talk about mourning and melancholia, and I know those are big concepts. Is there any way you could kind of connect the flow of what you're wanting to say about Freud to these two concepts in his thinking?
You mean mourning and melancholia?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just a brief note on his notion of object love.
Okay.
What's at stake there is something that I think a lot of people would find kind of a strange thing. Freud is claiming that love is always a relationship to an object.
Mm.
This is going to be part of what Lacan contests. Most, commonsensically, we think of being in love. You immediately want to know, well, what is it? Or better yet, more likely, who is the object of your love? Who's the object? Who are we talking about here? So Freud takes this kind of commonsensical, ordering or structure as the object character of the erotic impulse, that you love something, some object, some person. So Freud typically turns the person into an object, an object. That's already showing that the narcissistic stakes are exactly what's going on. I'm turning someone, a human being, a person, into a preferably really attractive, aesthetically and sexually attractive object. And so object love it's Freud's shorthand for love, precisely because he thinks all love is really kind of narcissistic. Now, in Mourning and Melancholia, what have you got? Again, the huge trace of the ego. Narcissism and ego are, we're talking about the psychical structure, ego, and its mode of self-preservation, narcissism. So in the object, when the object dies, then what's happened to you is your ego is destabilized. You don't know your way about it anymore. You go, oh my God, that was my crutch. That was what got me through things. It was a stabilizer. It
Mm.
was like outrigger on one of those, South Pacific canoes, it keeps things steady. That's my outrigger. That's my wife. That's my lover out there. That's my object, my love object. And it keeps me on an even keel. So mourning becomes the process by which I try to let go, which you could also say is, I got to get another outrigger. I
Yeah,
got to
yeah.
find somebody else or something else that performs this same function. And that's really hard because I've gotten so used to it that when the object is gone, I'm completely discombobulated.
Mm.
I'm all off balance. Now, melancholia for Freud, to put it in really simple terms, is the extreme depression. It's almost like depression on the borderline of being, feeling one's about to die of it.
Mm.
Melancholia is the inability to let go, which spirals the subject into a kind of terrible unhappiness is too weak a word, just a terrible aimlessness, a sort of nothingness. And so melancholia becomes really dangerous in Freud's view, precisely because the object cannot be relinquished. And you're therefore holding, literally, you're clinging now to something that is dead.
Yeah. Wow. One of the things I think about is phrases that people say in the modern world that I think underscores all this. They'll talk about in relationship to their partner, I need you, or I
Yeah,
would be nothing without you.
perfect. Yeah, those are perfect expressions for that last one in particular. Honey, I'd be nothing without you. Uh-oh. Really?
Yeah, right.
Love relation is the other person is a crutch without which you can't walk, or even better, he is a kind of cardiac pump without which his heart
Mm.
stop. It's the thing that keeps you upright, keeps you alive.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, that's all love on the side of narcissism. It shows you, by the way, that this business about narcissism is not a game. It's psychically really, their stakes are really heavy.
Mm.
So that you can, narcissistic love is not a mere game. It's the stakes are high. Nevertheless, when we get to it in a minute, Lacan's conception of what love is truly capable of, what genuine love, if we could use that phrase tentatively. Lacan doesn't, by the way.
Sure.
But if we could use that phrase for a second, it isn't just propping up your ego and making you feel safe and making you feel okay about yourself and about how other people feel about you. It's
Mm.
something else for him.
Something else. Yeah. Okay. So before we jump into Lacan, I think maybe a bridge would be, in your article, you talk about, I think it was 1920, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud, I don't know if he discovers or just starts to write about the death drive, the death principle. I guess what I'm wondering is there any way you could maybe define for us what he meant by that, and then how that connects to either his
Yeah,
understanding of love or how it helps us transition into Lacan?
exactly. Okay, great. Well, you're exactly right. The little book, it's a little but very important book in Freud's work, the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he calls it. It comes out in 1920. And here the timing is really important. It comes out, of course, just a year or two after the end of the dreadful bloodbath of the First World War.
Hmm.
And Freud has been seeing in his practice, consulting, seeing returning soldiers who are a wreck. They are what we would call utterly victims of PTSD. They're trauma victims. Back in those days, it was called shell shock.
Right.
But these are guys who've had their whole sense of life stability shattered, often by tremendous, really graphic violence to themselves or others. One of the interesting things Freud found, actually, is that the ones who had it the worst were the ones who weren't physically injured themselves. They
Hmm.
just saw other people blasted and dying. That's quite interesting.
That is very interesting.
However, one thing he is amazed at, and the real motive, or one of the most important motives for this really fundamental change in his whole outlook, introducing these two new ideas, this twin idea of a drive, a fundamental instinct, a Trieb in German. It's not actually instinct in German. There is a word in German, Instinct, but this is not using that word. This is not an animal instinct. Unfortunately, the translator into English, James Strachey, renders Trieben as drive, as instincts instead of as drives.
Mm.
But he has two drives, the life and the death drive. In that year, 1920, he invents these two absolutely primordial powers of the human subject. And he arrives at this notion of a death drive, or a self-destructive drive. That's really what it is. The life drive, or what Freud comes to call eros, is the drive to keep myself alive and keep myself intact. That's the drive of the ego. Ego stability and ego continuity is the whole object of the erotic or life drive. But what Freud discovers, contrary to his expectations, in these soldiers coming home, is that they can't stop living the trauma.
Mm.
In other words, they can't repress it. And Freud, of course, who has virtually discovered repression, and it's the theme of his whole work, he kind of thinks, wait a minute, what the hell's going on here? Why aren't these guys just repressing all this trauma? Instead of repressing it, they dream about it every night.
Mm.
They're obsessed with it. They're killing themselves with being unable to let go of it. And Freud finds other examples of this kind of self-punishing, self-attacking, and self-destroying impulse. And he says, wow, what if even more primordial than the desire to survive and to remain intact is some obscure desire for self-destruction, where you're drawn to death, ultimately your own.
Mm.
That's the radical theory he comes out with in 1920. And what has, interestingly, about that theory, what has to do with our topic,
Sure,
is that Freud says, so love is on the side of the life drive.
Mm.
That's where I stabilize myself in relation to the other who I love. They are my dependable stake in the ground that will keep me, from flying off into the oblivion. With this stabilizer, I can live. And death drive is something else. So love is on the side of life, or what Freud calls the erotic drive. And death is something else.
Mm.
It doesn't have to do with love. It's the absolute antithesis in some sense. It's the end of life. It's utter destruction.
Yeah, utter destruction. Wow. Now, as we transition into Lacan, maybe you could say a few words on how Lacan was actually connected to Freud, right? Because he would have considered himself a student of Freud.
Absolutely. And so actually, this is, for me, it's especially interesting because this is the first thing that got me into reading Lacan 40 years ago. That's kind of shocking, actually.
That's older than I've been alive.
I'm horrified, right? It actually was 40 years ago that I started getting into all this stuff. And I remember going to my going to the man who was going to finally be the director of my dissertation, William Robinson. And I said, Bill, I really want to write about the death drive. And he goes, oh no, don't do that. He said, no, don't do that. He says, that's horrible. It's so complicated. And he says, I don't know what's going on in that. And but I couldn't resist. And to his credit, Bill acquiesced and said, okay, whatever, I'll support it. But the idea of the death drive, I increasingly became aware and fascinated by, where Freud really put his positive chips on Eros, on the life drive. And the death drive is just this sheer self-destruction. It's kind of like this nihilism, this horrifying kind of attraction to absolute darkness on the one side of the human being, which Freud thought was actually the most primordial drive, the drive that sucks us back into the vortex, you know. Lacan says, yeah, this is the most fundamental drive. But what Freud missed is this is the drive that the unconscious is really controlled by. That the death drive, that Eros, the life drive, yeah, that's associated with ego. The death drive is associated with the unconscious and with the subject, where subject is an inner sense of myself that doesn't have the neat, tidy, reassuring closure and stability of the ego. The subject is the part of me that I don't know so well, but is even more central to my being. So when I fall in love and I don't even know why I picked this person, I'm as baffled as anybody else. More so, in fact. But that's exactly what I'm attracted to. Then we're not in the domain of the life drive, or what Freud called Eros. Then we're in the grips of Thanatos, the death drive, the Totentrieb, the death drive.
Yeah.
And this is where this now, really, in really basic terms, we've got the Lacanian departure from Freud.
Okay.
What Lacan wants to say is, sure, there's the trophy wife. Sure, there's the love which is serving the ego. It's my love supports my sense of myself and just makes me feel more confident. But that's not the deepest and most significant and most truly human kind of love. The real mystery love is the love that is a risk, that you to yourself don't know what you're getting pulled into. And even when you're in it, it's in some sense beyond you. You don't control it. It has something about the death drive motivating it.
Yeah.
Notice one last quick thing.
Sure.
This means Lacan has moved out of the biological. Freud was thinking the death drive is like actually written into our very physical being.
Gotcha.
That's what makes us grow old and finally kick the bucket. Lacan says, no. We're not dealing with biology here. This is a psychological drive. It's a drive to the very idea of dissolution, not its biological reality. So falling in love with Lacan is a drama for the unconscious subject, not the conscious ego. And therefore, it's really tied up more with the death drive than it is with the life or erotic drive.
Sure. Now, I don't think this is a detour, but one of the things that I was hoping you could just maybe shed a little bit of light on, in light of what you just said in your article, you talk about Lacan's relationship to ego psychology.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can kind of say about that briefly in terms of why he was so opposed to that and how maybe that connects to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, precisely. Well, this is after Freud, when people like David Rappaport and others got into sort of reshaping Freudian theory after Freud's death. It was particularly common in the UK and particularly in America, where ego psychology became almost a kind of equivalent, the sort of, two-term equivalent of psychoanalytic theory. And the idea was that the real purpose of analysis is to get your various kind of ducks in a row so you can be more effective and more, the big buzzword was adaptive challenges of life, which really can translate into, we want to make you a more effective, successfully adaptive ego.
Got
That
you.
part of you that defines your well-being, we want to make sure that guy's really operating and get unconscious conflicts under control so you can become the CEO or whatever your aim is.
Sure.
And Lacan recognized that this offshoot of psychoanalysis was precisely a betrayal of Freud's most profound insights. Now, admittedly, we have to say Freud is not wholly free from this ego psychological thing himself. His daughter Anna was very much a prime reference for the ego psychologists.
Well, and I wondered too, like, this is one of the questions I had for you. This fits in perfectly. I can't remember when, is it the ego and the id, when that was written in relationship to, the rest of his work, but doesn't he say something like, where the id was, there the ego shall be?
Yes, exactly.
And
The
I've
ego and
always
the id is
wondered.
actually 3 years after the Beyond the Pleasure Principles. So
Okay.
3 years after the death drive is introduced, the ego and the id arrives. And
Okay.
yeah, the ego and the id sort of is relegating to the id all the dark, deadly stuff. And the light and positive and optimistic stuff, the stuff we need to cultivate, is on the side of the ego. And it's the big buzzword that Anna Freud so takes over is the defenses of the ego, by which she meant basically something good. The ego has to have a defensive kind of repertoire to protect itself from lack of confidence or ultimately failure. And a lot of people, I trained with one myself in Cambridge, when I was at Harvard for a while. There was a guy who was a really well-known ego psychologist. And this was the whole thing, the defenses of the ego, the ways in which we keep ourselves really on the straight and narrow, successful producers, you might say, kind of the ultimate goal of the ego psychologists and their adaptation. So yeah, Lacan drags, and this is the meaning of his famous return to Freud. What he really wants to do is he wants to get back to the unconscious, back to what we're not in control of, back to this, what he then starts calling early on, not the ego, but le sujet, the subject.
The subject.
The unconscious subject.
Sure. Okay, I do. If this is okay, just I have another question. I think this is Freud, but you bring it up in the section where you're exploring Lacan's understanding of love, and you have this statement where you say the ego is the seat of repression, or ego a seat of repression.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe help us understand what you meant by that and how that connects to the overall flow of what we've been talking about in the argument in your article.
Yeah, actually. When I see my own phrase written like that, I my impulse is to change it.
Okay. Hey, I can edit it real quick.
Seat is a little funny word there. Maybe the ego as agency of repression. I mean, the ego is the raison d'être of repression. I mean, it's for the sake of the ego that I keep certain things repressed. I don't want, when I go into my job interview, I don't want to be thinking about the unsettling dream I had last night. I don't want to be thinking about the ways in which my father treated me in a way that made me lose my confidence. I got to sweep all that stuff away. I got to repress a lot of stuff. So I kind of pull myself together to be my best, fighting self. I try to maximize my ego powers, you might say. And Lacan thinks whatever that is, don't call it psychoanalysis.
Okay.
Psychoanalysis means opening yourself up, especially to the dreams that seem to be nonsensical, especially to the moments of your childhood that were most devastating, especially to your feelings of insecurity and anxiety. Those are the directions in which you're going to come into contact with your own unconscious, with the darker forces that are not helping you get a job and feel in total control of your existence. They're going to be the things that are really a deep, unsettling, anxiety-producing challenge.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. Okay, Rick. I mean, again, this may be a little bit of a detour, but I think it's all connected. I've actually learned to phrase what I'm going to say from your writing, especially your book, Sex on the Couch. But I think in common understandings of Freud, which is probably not always accurate, it's easy for the sake of presentation to talk about the ego being kind of the conscious element, and then the id is the unconscious element. But you've talked about there's a part of the ego which is unconscious as well. And I believe Freud writes that in Ego and Id. And I'm wondering if you could maybe reflect on that a little bit.
That is true. There is a portion of ego that is unconscious to us. So it isn't. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's not like the ego is simply my construction. One way to see this, by the way, is go back to the way in which your childhood, let's say, left you with a certain kind of ego.
Mm.
Let's say, for instance, in my own childhood, this is now we're going to do a little Rick Boothby psychoanalysis.
All right.
Sounds terrible, doesn't it? I had an older brother who was very, I would say, I think this is correct. I think he was really threatened when I arrived. This other competitor shows up 14 months after him. And it became really difficult when I grew 6 or 7 inches taller than him in adolescence. But I was a sort of a threat from the very get-go. And I would say that I only discovered this in my adulthood. I discovered it in my own analysis, actually, that I had unconsciously, without ever intending anything, I styled my ego, my understanding of my social self and my proper role working and living with other people. I understood myself as the guy who makes everything okay. I'm the peacemaker. I'm the joke maker. I make everybody feel comfortable. This is okay. We're going to have fun here, everybody. Don't worry. That became my job in my family, my self-assigned job. Consciously self-assigned? No. I didn't even know that I'd really picked this self, this particular ego, this particular pleaser ego. But I had unconsciously. That's unconscious ego stuff.
Sure,
right?
sure.
But here was the other unconscious dimension. I had no idea where this came from. I never, first of all, I didn't even know I had picked a certain persona. The nice guy, the trouble avoider, the one who made everybody feel as comfortable as possible. Something bad happens, and I said, no, let's not let that get upset us. Let's just keep having a good time, which was crap, of course. I didn't realize that this was my way of countering my brother's mistreatment. He would beat me up or make me, use me as a kind of a punching bag as a kid. I withdrew into this kind of fabricated self that was the always happy, always making everybody else happy boy.
Right.
It was a compensation for what really was a kind of rage. If I killed my brother, I probably would have. But instead, I turned into the person who couldn't possibly hurt a flea. So there's an ego whose road into the world was largely, if not completely, unconscious. And I only learn about it when I'm, I don't know, 35 or 40.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so powerful and very meaningful to me. It connects so much with my own ego formation. But yeah, that's going to mean a lot, I think, to a lot of people. Rick,
Here's
thank you for your
here's
vulnerability.
one more one
Sure.
more little piece of it. I still see you have ego as agency of repression up there. I used to have used to play a lot of tennis,
Mm,
uh, and my salad days. Still play squash, but that's less demanding than tennis. But at least for me, anyway, I would often mess up a shot, and I'd get so mad, and or if I got really behind and I wasn't liking my playing, I'd get angry, and then of course I would get much worse. I'd make even more mistakes. Anger would make me more of a failure.
mm,
Whereas my favorite partner, a dear friend of mine, still my closest friend, he would be able to resist getting um, negatively angry. He could use his anger. If he did get angry, he got better.
wow.
And I couldn't understand that. And finally, again, years later, I realized my own ego structure, which I had unconsciously chosen for myself, which was to be the nice guy, that guy doesn't get angry. That guy does not want to cause a fight. But what it was running into and what was making me worse, even more liable to double fault or to miss a ball or hit it out of the court, was actually I was raising a kind of unconscious crisis in myself. I was
Mm,
getting angry and violating my cardinal rule of being a coherent ego. I'm the nice guy. I'm the pleasant, cheery, harmless guy. I'm not the killer.
mm.
I don't have that outrageous anger. But that was false. I did. Underneath there somewhere, I wanted not just to win the match, I wanted to kill the other guy who was in the position of my tormenting brother.
Right.
So you see how this stuff is really, we're not talking, something that's far away from where we live. It's actually the house we build for ourselves,
Absolutely.
these unconscious dynamics.
Absolutely, Rick. Yeah, no, that's so good. Okay, here's kind of where I want to transition a little bit, just kind of following your article. We're going to bring in Mari Ruti in for a second as well, because I think for both her and for you, in terms of Lacanian concepts, Das Ding is super important,
Mm.
and you have some really powerful reflections around Das Ding and love in your article. I wonder if you could kind of speak to that wherever you feel led.
Yeah, Mari does this in more places than one. Um, but in this little kind of popular book, it's a very easy read. It's not a real scholarly book, but it's very, very good. It's called The Case for Falling in Love. It's kind of like why falling in love is a wonderful thing, you could say.
Hmm.
And Mari, yeah, centers the whole book. She doesn't really mention it until almost halfway into the book, but the book is conceptually centered on this notion of das Ding, the German meaning the thing, the unknown in the other. Here, Lacan steals something from Freud, something rejected by Freud. It's in his unpublished project for a scientific psychology. He says, what if the infant regards the mother with a kind of dual perception? On the one hand, he sees her as like him. This is exactly what Lacan calls the imaginary.
Right.
She has two eyes, I have two eyes. She has a nose and a mouth, I have a nose and a mouth. She has a right and a left, so do I. We're sort of mirror images, and that's consoling. That's calming. I like that. That makes me feel good. But then, maybe especially when the mother starts saying things, which I don't understand because I don't know, I don't speak yet, I realize there's something about this other person who is so important to me and otherwise makes me feel so good. There's something about her I don't understand. She's a mystery. She's a thing, an unknown thing. Freud kind of leaves this concept behind, but Lacan picks it up. And he really picks it up in a, I find, a fascinating way. I would say I'm extraordinarily fascinated by it. I really, my whole career, I've been kind of, this probably the most, for me, the most illuminating and promising concept in Lacan's whole work. But Mari shares some of that. And her little book on love, and she does it in other books about love, but this one that I talk about in this essay is The Case for Falling in Love. It's a matter of the unknown in the other, which I find a brilliant insight. What she's really saying is, when you really fall for somebody, it's not because you've counted up their, positives. Notice it's precisely not what dating apps do.
Exactly.
Where you make the list of stuff you want.
Right.
And you check, oh yes, handsome, yes, check. Not fat, check. Not bald, check. No. Mari
Or
says,
so many people ask someone who's recently dating, how many things do you have in common? What are your shared interests?
Yeah. Exactly. Mari is basically saying that's not falling in love. Don't fool yourself. Yeah, that's shopping for what you think is the ideal partner.
Yeah.
Not falling in love. They don't call it falling for nothing. You're falling because you're going into a kind of an abyss. And what's the abyss? It's precisely you're attracted to somebody and you don't really know why. It's beyond what you know, but you're still pulled by it. In fact, you're even more powerfully pulled for the very fact that you don't know what's really doing it. You kind of go, I don't know, I don't have anything in common with this chick, but I am like crazy about her. And Mari would say, and I think she's right, that's love. Does that mean you should marry this person? Maybe not.
Fair point.
That's what love feels like when we're really falling in love. Again, the word is a lovely,
it's wonderful
English terminology for it. Yeah, you're kind of out of control. You are, and you're sensing something in the other that is on the level of something unconscious. It's not available for conscious ego calculation. It's something that you can sense but cannot name. That's what Lacan calls das Ding, the unknown thing in the other.
Wonderful. Okay, so in kind of the last part of the article, you bring in Badiou, Alain Badiou.
Yeah.
What would you want to highlight about his understanding of love, how it kind of fits into what you were trying to articulate in terms of Lacan's understanding of love? I'd love for you to riff on Badiou and love, if you can.
Right. Well, Badiou, of course, is his own show in a way. He's a very, very brilliant French philosopher, but Lacan was a crucial reference in his own intellectual development and overall outlook. So it's not like Lacan is something he's deeply familiar with, but also remains, really connected with in a very profound way.
Okay.
And Badiou has a number of places where he talks about this, but the easiest point of entry is a small book. I don't know if I have it nearby here, but it's a small book called In Praise of Love. It's actually a series of interviews where most of it is responding to questions of the interviewer. But the thesis he puts forward, he says, is very explicitly a Lacanian thesis. And it is that he agrees with Mari Ruti. He doesn't mention Mari, but he agrees with her basic point that love is being taken in some sense by something in the other we do not understand and do not control. We sense it somehow. We respond to it. We fall for it, but we don't really know what it is. And Badiou really doubles down on this. Another really simple way to say it is a couple who fall in love and really feel this for each other are responding unconsciously to something that is in the unconscious of the other.
Hmm.
It's not ego to ego. It's not filling out the shopping list and being able to check the most features that are winners.
Right.
No, it's precisely having a sense that you don't know how to explain even to yourself, let alone to them, of something that you respond to. So Badiou is basically saying that love is maybe going to be very inconvenient for your ego-driven life. It may not be an easy thing to accommodate into your life. It may make a mess of things, but it's going to be a great mess.
Hmm.
Something that is really meaningful. And here's Badiou's big extra point, and now this is more clear than Mari.
Okay.
Here he says, this is your opportunity, the biggest opportunity you have in and through this love relationship that is founded upon real unconscious response. This is your best chance of really growing and really changing. This is not just getting together because she makes me feel good and I make her feel good. This has got more the dimensions of a challenge where you really wonder, man, am I good enough?
Yeah.
What have I got to that's even in the right ballpark to what she seems to have, or he, or whatever.
Sure.
And Badiou then really paints he paints this picture of love if it's genuinely entered into in this way. And of course, here we have to remind ourselves, Freud's ego to ego love, there's plenty of that around.
Yeah.
It's not like Badiou is saying, I've finally discovered the truth of all love. No, he's just saying there is this more authentic, more unconsciously tuned relation of love. And that's a whole different story. It's not shoring up your confidence that you do know yourself. It's
Hmm.
allowing you to take the risk of what you don't know about yourself and invites you to go more deeply into it. And you will be transformed as you do.
Hmm. I don't like the way I'm thinking about this, but I'm just going to say it. Maybe you can kind of like untangle it, maybe express it in a better way. But as I was reading your article, I thought maybe for Lacan, it's about the destabilization of the ego. Does Badiou then add a way that we can expand the ego, and I highlighted his idea of love in the two, that it isn't just about the dissolution of the ego, but it's about the experience or the reality of something greater. And in that sense, it's a bit of a positive thing too. So it's not just negative. We're not just
Yeah,
taking something away. Something can potentially be added.
to yourself, you mean?
Yes. And I don't know if
Yeah.
that's right, but that's kind of how I understood it. I was hoping you could maybe correct me or point us in a different direction if it's understood in a different way.
Okay. Well, first of all, Lacan, Badiou rather, is very explicit in even evoking Lacan and his perspective about how this really invites you outside of your ego identity.
Mm,
Not only is your ego identity in a certain place not the real um, agency that is getting called up into action here, but that the love relation in this more profound way, unconscious to unconscious, this is going to be beside the point of the ego and even threaten it. Um, I mean, one possible imagination of this, by the way, is the emerging LGBTQ subject who doesn't yet even really know that their deep desire is not heterosexual.
Mm.
And they're pulled to something that is going to mess with their ego. It's going to like shatter their ego. But it also may be, in a very profound sense, exactly the right thing they need to do.
Yeah.
All the way along, they may feel like, my God, this is insane. But one way to talk about this, I think Badiou kind of lets this off almost as a joke, but it's very profound. He thinks, usually we have this cliche that love takes two and fuses them into one.
Mm.
That the two people get to the altar and swear to be true to each other, and they walk out as one.
Right.
And Badiou says, no, it's the opposite. You come into love as one, your ego, and you leave as two,
Mm.
your ego and your unconscious. But there's now another dimension of the one. In real love, one becomes two. Not only does self come to realize its division and it's challenged by its own unconscious, but each of you come out of your singularity, your concern for self, again, ego, and you agree to become a couple.
Mm.
Lacan, Badiou really emphasizes this word. We have to really stick with the word couple as a two-ness. The best, most authentic love relation, says Badiou, and this is, I think it's pure Lacan, is the one where the two-ness is not resolved into some kind of oneness. No. You're really together, but you remain separate.
Mm.
The separateness remains a kind of constructive challenge, stimulating, growth-producing challenge. So what Badiou is, I think, asking for here is really uncommon in fact. I don't know how many out of 100 love affairs, love relations could qualify for Badiou's ideal here. I suspect a minority.
Mm.
In this sense, Freud is not at all out of date by all this. It's not like Freud's totally wrong. Most love relationships are ego to ego, back to our trophy wife.
Right. Right.
When trophy wife is just one version of the ego to ego relation. Most
Sure.
love relations may be basically, yes, they're kind of detente between two egos. They are the easiest thing to, and the least threatening thing, and the least adventure of the subject is involved in those kind of relationships. But what Badiou wants to hold out for, citing Lacan as his source in a sense, is what if you really take your partner as the stimulus and challenge for becoming something that you yourself have never dared to really open up about yourself, about your own unconscious, about your own impulses, about your own inner subjective truth.
Mm.
That's the best of what love can be. It challenges you to actually become something beyond your ego, to bust out of your ego in some important measure and actually become a bit something you've never been before.
Yeah. Love's creative potential. I love that. Okay, so I have one potentially tough question for you that I want to kind of end on, but before I do that, I'll just say for whoever's listening, if they're interested in Badiou, he actually wrote, I think it's the foreword to one of my favorite philosophers, Byung-Chul Han, has a book on love called The Agony of Eros. And he has maybe 2 or 3 pages on love, which is just phenomenal. If anyone's just wanting a quick entry into his work, I would recommend they check that one out. And Byung-Chul Han's book on love is incredible too, and would probably align with a lot of what we're saying. But yeah, Badiou has this great little almost like a mini essay that he writes for that book, and it's incredible.
Mhm.
Okay, so here's kind of my question for you. I don't know if you've thought much about it, but in terms of what we've been talking about, especially Lacan and then Badiou's understanding of love, is there any place for what I think a lot of modern couples are experimenting with, thinking about, is this idea of polyamory, which I know is not just a modern phenomenon, but it's, at least in some of the couples that I work with, some of the individuals that I see in therapy, this is a really live kind of reality and question and issue. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, especially in light of the idea of the two and the couple. I don't want to read that too literally, but is something like polyamory a possibility in this framing of love that we've been talking about, or is it problematic? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it if you would feel comfortable speaking to it.
I I'm delighted to speak to it, despite the fact that it makes me quite uncomfortable.
Okay.
That is to say, I the discomfort is this: I don't want to um, be perceived here as making a kind of blanket.
Sure.
Um, I don't know much about polyamory as a real practice, and I don't mean to foreclose the possibility that it might be. And I think there are instances in life when it has been quite obviously something really meaningful.
Sure.
Um, so really a rich, if complicated and difficult, human relationship structure. However, having said that, um, I don't, as I read Badiou and as I read Lacan, um, I do think there's a cautionary note,
Mm.
which would be this: um, that if Badiou is correct, that in the most valuable kind of love relation, two ones actually become two, a couple. That is to say, they don't fuse in some kind of unitary ego.
Sure.
They enter a relationship that is going to be constantly fraught with a certain amount of tension. It's going to be a challenge to you, and not just a challenge to your ego, not just a challenge to make this work. It's,
Right.
can you answer to your own unconscious in a way that you never have before, where
Mm.
the lover, the beloved, the other person who in the love relationship actually um, prompts you in various ways, not by hectoring you or not by telling you things necessarily, but just by being different. Um, they challenge you to dig deeper and evolve your own unconscious structure to some extent. That's what Badiou's after, I think. And I think on that score, whatever else he might say about polyamory, he might caution is an awfully tempting game to be played,
Mm.
where you get two lovers going, two or more, but it's the ego at the roulette table that's really playing the game.
Mm.
In other words, maybe the best way to end this is, I think the Lacanian / Badiouian vision, add Mari Ruti in too, it's her vision too. This vision of love doesn't necessarily insist that we have one partner or two or 10.
Okay.
What it insists upon is it's a relationship that is challenging because it's not flattering my sense of ego,
Mm.
not flattering my narcissism, my happiness about my cool self. Rather, it's at a deep level, really charging me and challenging me with stuff I've repressed. by the way, here's a little
It's great.
example. I'll leave you with this. This
Yeah.
is another outlandish self-revelation.
Yes.
We were talking shameless, right? The other A moment ago, I was talking about, I was being quite honest, my brother, who was somewhat threatened by me, my arrival a year and a quarter after his, and my withdrawal from aggressiveness, my my decision, mostly unconsciously as a kid, to just not get into the battlefield with my brother, just to avoid it. So I would just disappear in my own little secret, precincts. I literally had precincts. One of them was I'd go out on the lake in a canoe by myself, at 8 years,
Mm,
escape altogether. Um, or I would, go into drawings or books or whatever, philosophy, by myself. I'd be a sort of loner.
mm,
Um, but anger has always been hard for me.
mm.
In my second marriage, which is now about 18 years old, uh, I never fought in my first marriage. But I shouldn't say I never fought, but fighting was something we almost never did.
Sure.
But the marriage was not made better for that. I would say my second marriage, not perfect, no marriage is, but we have fights.
Mm,
Rebecca has taught me how to fight a lot more effectively. And by effectively, I don't mean win more times. I
sure.
mean be able to psychologically kind of go through real tensions together and emerge on the other side still loving each other.
Mm, that's
That
beautiful.
is something I have not known how to do in my life. And it took a lot of work, but a lot of being open and coming to trust someone in a way I had never done before.
Mm,
And I think that's not unrelated to what Badiou is saying, that you have lessons to learn from the other that are not going to be easy. And they're not lessons that are absorbed on the level of ego. They're on the level of what Lacan calls subject, which is your unconscious structure.
sure.
Those repressive impulses to not let yourself get boiling mad. And if you do, you can't manage it. Well, I'm a lot better, I have to say. I'm by far from being perfect, but
Yeah.
I'm a lot better at allowing myself to feel anger and speak and act on it in some limited ways than I
Sure.
ever was before in my life. And I think has been a gift, a very
You know,
hard-won gift, but a gift of my second marriage.
Rick, again, thank you so much for being vulnerable and bringing it into your personal life. Where maybe I want to end, see if this resonates with you, is I know you started your article with the image of the Freudian understanding of love as the other as a mirror to kind of reflect our ego identity back to us. I wonder in what you just said if one of the roles of a loving partnership is to be a type of mirror to help us see some of those unconscious realities and to provide a structure where we can work on them.
That's interesting.
They can also be a mirror, but not necessarily to shore up our ego or to just reflect what we want to see, but to maybe reflect the parts of us that we can't see and maybe that we don't want to see. That the lover is a type of mirror in that sense as well.
I like your metaphor in one sense because I like that idea of seeing something different in the other and in yourself. But I also would want to take a step back from the metaphor in this way. Traditional ego to ego love is very much a mirror relation.
Mm,
It's looking at the other and ultimately finding a sort of reflection of yourself, something that you at least can really recognize in the other. And you can say, she or he is like me. And that's
sure.
reassuring. I like that. But the kind of love that Badiou is talking about and that Lacan here, I think, is really, in his own understated way, he's much less explicit than Badiou is about it. But this Lacanian, Badiouian love, I think it's not so much invested in looking at all.
Mm.
It's invested in feeling with the other. What do I feel with this person? And allowing those feelings to be as challenging as they sometimes are, and not flee from them, but let them begin to really move me in ways that I may learn from. That may be hard, but I may learn all the more because they're hard.
Yeah. Oh, that's powerful. I love that. Okay. I know that I've come to the end of the questions that I wanted to ask you about your incredible article. Is there anything else that you would want to share before we sign off?
Uh, I guess the only thing I would say is that it's a funny thing about Badiou. In some ways, he is such an incredibly acute mind, and a lot of his deepest philosophical insights have been very close to being mathematical. He's very
Mm.
interested in set theory. He's a very abstract thinker. But I have to say, it's striking to me that he also is astonishingly um, humane, um, not abstract, able to really talk about emotional realities of the human
Mm.
being, existential realities. He calls love an ontological challenge, challenging
Ooh.
us in our very being. And I think he is an extraordinary, to my mind, he's still living. He's older now. He's 87, I think.
Wow.
But he is 86. He is, he's quite an extraordinary philosopher, I think, in this regard, of someone who is uh, an intellectual who we can really admire.
Mm.
Uh, not just a he's not just intoxicated with abstraction. He really has retained a kind of deep humanity, even
Mm.
in his philosophical work, which I take to be very impressive.
Mm. That's great. Yeah. Anyone listening should probably check him out.
He's a hard nut to crack. I mean, he's written both super dense and difficult, highly abstract works, and but he's also written, like this little book in praise of love, which is a very accessible piece. He's also provided some things that are of a different tone and much more digestible.
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, anyone who's listening, he wrote this little piece for Byung Chul Han's "The Agony of Eros," which would take a couple minutes to read, but has some profound nuggets in it.
Hmm.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for your time. I hope that in the future you'll come back on. I'm sure we'll find something to have a conversation about.
Yes, I hope so too, Kika.
Okay, well, thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much for having me.